Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of the Nintendo Archive. I am your host, Holden, and this episode is going to be just like all the others. It will feature a brief discussion on some games I've been playing, followed by a lengthier Wii game review. Now, before I get into that, I would just like to thank God for all his provisions and for allowing me to do this podcast. As for all you listening, I hope you enjoy. So the first game I'm going to talk about is this little game called Resident Evil 4. It's an obscure title. Came out sometime in 2005, kind of went under the radar. And I decided to give it a go, and initially I wasn't keen on doing such a thing because I don't really like zombie games, and I don't like horror games. And I also am usually suspicious of critically acclaimed games, which this game, in all seriousness, was very critically acclaimed and very successful to boot. Of course, I have never played 2 seconds of this game, so I didn't know what to expect. But I must say that all that praise was in fact merited, which I often feel isn't the case, so it's a pleasant surprise that a game that's so lauded is almost everything people make it out to be. It's simply a good game, and one that's finely crafted in nearly all aspects, which for a GameCube title is actually pretty rare, surprisingly. I mean, a lot of the GameCube titles I've been playing are very enjoyable and very creative, but they often aren't, without some glaring flaws, whether that be a rushed project or the result of inexperience in in 3D game design. I don't know what it is, but this Resident Evil 4 seems to have everything going for it. The feel of the game's good, the graphics are good, the mood of the game in tandem with the graphics is very spot on. The progression of the game is really good. The enemy encounters are surprisingly on point almost throughout, and the level design is also reasonably good for what it is. It's at the end of it all, I determined that it was a quintessential action-adventure game. I've heard it said that it was seminal in popularizing the third-person shooter, which actually scared me off from it because I don't really consider that genre in gaming to be all that worthwhile. I mean, I enjoy Gears of War, don't get me wrong, but mechanically speaking, usually third-person shooters aren't any good. So the idea that this game's best quality is its third-person shooting is a little silly to me. It's very good, don't get me wrong, but it's, I think, everything around that shooting that makes this game land, particularly the enemy encounters. The first enemy encounter, the first big one, is a good litmus test for how well structured the game is. When about 30 minutes into it, you find the villagers in this strange little village have set fire to one of your cop friends, and they're very, very dead, spiked through the chest and all that. And the minute you enter that combat scenario, you have a pistol and a knife, and the entire village just kind of turns on you without any kind of warning. And so you're looking this way down this street, shooting at them, trying to score headshots, and also trying to use your knife to conserve ammo. And then to your right, they're then coming down from the other street, and they didn't necessarily give themselves away when they're doing it. They're not very fast, but they will creep up on you without you realizing it. And so just that one encounter, it showed how likely you are to get swarmed by numbers you're not comfortable with. It shows how you'll run out of ammo and have to use the knife, and it also showed how you could get yourself cornered if you weren't careful. I ended that encounter in a little hut, slashing at the zombie villagers or whatever they are. Los Granados or something, or Ganados. I don't think that's what they're calling the game, so they're not really zombies, but they're zombies. And then as I was slashing away at them, because I had spent all my ammo, the bell rang in a cutscene, and they all ambled away, which was really good timing because I was not in a good spot. That's a cat. You have to forgive that. Putting in the way the cat, I forgot where I was. So, back to that first encounter, the first big encounter. Once I had survived it, I went exploring around the village, and I discovered that if I had gone to my left, I would have found a house where I could have barred the door with a dresser and found a shotgun on a mantle, which would have been very helpful. And seeing that demonstrated that while the encounter was quite tightly crafted, that it also had a modicum of wiggle room to it. It had some element of open design, some variety within it, which is impressive to me. That first encounter kind of has so many things within it, and it kind of serves as a microcosm for the rest of the game, where a lot of the encounters with the game, because Leon is somewhat slow and easily blindsided, positioning yourself when you're getting swarmed is very important. Ammo is very important, so you have to make your shots count. I am playing on the Wii version of the game, so I'm probably having a much easier time of it than if I was on the GameCube. But even so, with the Wii controls, you still have to pick your shots. And you also have to use your items wisely, particularly the grenades. There's one grenade, the flame grenade or whatever it's called, where if you have multiple strands of enemies coming at you, if you throw a fire grenade, it kind of creates a flame wall, a narrow one that will kill or slow down the one strand so you can focus on the other without too much hassle. Or you can use flashbangs to knock a large number of them out to reload or run past them. Or you can use certain strategic points in the map, such as climbing up a ladder onto a roof or into a loft and then shooting or cutting the villagers in the face as they climb up, while of course keeping an eye on the windows because they might come that way too. There's a number of ways to pick your position or change it that make the combat encounters more interesting than, say, your 7th gen cover shooters. At least that's how I saw it, anyhow. And all those considerations are just pertaining to the standard encounters with the enemies of the game, which are already reasonably good as they are, but the developer also sprinkled in much more exciting encounters as well that keep the game fresh and allow it to never enter a slump. Those special encounters can be with a giant monster creature, or they can be with a lake monster, or they can entail the character of Leon being stuck in a house while villagers in the order of about 80 storm it. And so it's kind of like a proto-Nazi zombies in a way, that particular section, where you have to bar the windows and defend multiple points of entry. And there's more special encounters still that I haven't gotten into, some of which are orchestrated via good level design, like a narrow bridge with enemies on either side, or a vertical ascension, things like that. The developers of this game, Capcom, they just went above and beyond when it came to combat encounters, and they add an element of meaning to those encounters, because ammo is never absolutely scarce, but it's scarce enough that you appreciate it. And so that gives the exploration and treasures and collectibles you find in the map a little bit of bite, because rather than those activities just being a fun little aside, they are critical in sustaining you throughout the duration of your adventure. You find treasure that allows you to buy new guns or upgrade the guns you have via the merchant. You find ammo throughout the map. You find special guns even sometimes, and healing items too. It's not just a optional aside, it's very integral to the game itself. And the game, in addition to the combat, also has other things going for it. It has a number of little Zelda-esque puzzles that break up the pace and keep the game interesting throughout, and the puzzles range from simple to sometimes devious. Mostly it's just a matter of observation and scouring the map for a visual clue, such as in the graveyard by that church. But then other puzzles actually require some thinking. I finally broke down and learned how to solve a sliding puzzle after all this time. I had normally just sort of brute forced them, but when this game proffered up one, I became tired of the trial and error way of doing it. And there's other ways still that the game injects itself with variety. Probably a few too many to mention. Some mini games, a linear but expansive map to explore, and most importantly, a steady trickle of new and exciting weapons and kit to liven up the combat. So I think when it comes down to it overall, I don't know if I'd call the game flawless. It probably has a few too many QTEs. I think it maybe even made those popular. But even within the context of this game, the QuickTime events are actually more tolerable than they would be in later games. They fit in some weird way. I wouldn't say they're successful, but they make more sense in this game than in others at the very least. So this game, it just represents a shocking amount of craft throughout. The world is really beautiful, and well, not beautiful, but it looks really good, particularly the castle that you spend 40% of the game in the village looks good. The final area, not so much, but with how good everything else looks, it's forgivable. The character models look great. The audio design of this game is really good. You can always hear the encounters before they start. And even the soundtrack, while not being melodic by any means, is pretty solid in its own right. Particularly one track, which I don't know the name of it, but I liked it quite a bit. The gun feel is pretty spot on. as far as shotguns and video games go, this one's pretty tight. It's pretty good. And even things that people have cited as being somewhat bad aren't even that bad by any means. I'm of course referring to the fact that large portions of this game are effectively a escort mission, but I never found that to be too much of a problem, if any kind of problem at all. I actually thought they handled the character of Ashley reasonably well in terms of how helpless she is. One thing I liked in particular was if you pointed a gun in her direction, she would instinctively duck. And so I never had an issue with accidentally hitting her, with the exception of the submachine gun. I seemed to hit her with the recoil when she was being carried off by a zombie. So even though I started low, it would just kick up and then get her and she'd be instantly dead. But it's kind of funny at the end of the day, so I didn't worry about it too much. So as I said, the game really just excels in craft on all fronts. It's a tour de force in game development. I don't think there's games like it out there right now, hardly, except for maybe Mario games and some Zelda games. There's really no weakness in Resident Evil 4. Not a weakness that's within the game itself. If you have a complaint that you're bringing with you to the game, that's another matter. But within its own design, it's excellent. And a lot of games, whether they be indie games or AAA games, they usually, at least as I see it, are often fixating on maybe one or two things and getting those things right, while the other aspects are left somewhat undeveloped or lackluster, leading to a feeling of unevenness within the game. And that's not the case with Resident Evil 4. It's pushing the envelope in all categories. And that's very, very commendable. So, for a game that I was reticent to even play, and a game I only paid $9 for on eBay, it was real solid. But that's all I'll say about it for now. The second game I'll talk about is also a generally revered title, as far as I understand it, and that is Paper Mario on the N64. I had started a game file some years ago, probably 5 years ago at this point, and I had made it to the Shy Guy toy box portion of the game. Was in the middle of that when I walked away from it. So I picked it up from there, and everything before that point is pretty much forgotten, as far as I know. I'm sure if someone brought up a section before Shy Guy's toy box, I would recollect, but I really don't know what happens at the beginning of the game for the most part. But either way, I started in the middle of the game, which is a little rough for an RPG, and was able to get going again. And now I'm at the last chapter of the game, Bowser's Castle. As for my thoughts on the game, for one thing, I think for a N64 title, the game looks really good in spite of its hardware, and often because of its hardware. I particularly like the backgrounds in the game. They're sort of abstract watercolor look, or however you put it, where there's not a lot of detail, but it forms a cohesive backdrop anyhow, and it plays really nice with the lower poly textures in the 3D space itself, it looks really good. I think the game, while probably not looking as good as Thousand Year Door, which of course I haven't played yet, still retains its own unique graphical style that hasn't tarnished with time. The music in the game is reasonably good. Sometimes I feel it's just sort of placeholder, ho-hum, cheery music. But in the case of Shivertown and the Palace of Ice or whatever else, the music is quite varied and is overall very good. So overall, as far as audio visual experiences go on the N64, Paper Mario is probably up there as one of the best, if not the best. As far as gameplay goes, I'm a little hesitant to share how I feel about it because I hate it. I don't know if that's a legitimate hatred, but I do not really care for the gameplay in this game at all. Which isn't surprising because I generally hate turn-based games. Unless it pertains to strategy RPGs, but the turn-based nature of those games is entirely different from a party-based game or a traditional JRPG. And comparing this game to Super Mario RPG in terms of its combat, I know Super Mario RPG also had the timing conceit within its turn-based combat, but I think the fact that it was less pronounced than it is in Paper Mario lends it some element of mystery and, moreover, keeps it out of the way. Because while the time-sensitive button presses in the Paper Mario combat do make the turn-based battles in the game more interesting, they don't make it interesting enough to justify those battles, in my opinion. And so in a regular RPG, like, I don't know, Final Fantasy III, I don't actually know the battle system of that game. I'm sure I'll know shortly. But in the case of that game or a game like it, Final Fantasy V, whatever, you could probably just hammer through battles, just hit the A button once you had picked your options. And due to the rinse-repeat nature of turn-based games, as far as I'm concerned anyway, you could do so liberally. But in the case of Paper Mario, the timing sensitivity precludes you from doing that without damaging the effectiveness of your attacks. And again, in theory, that sounds like the turn-based action is more developed, but that's not always a good thing. If you take, say, the sailing in Wind Waker and the horse riding in Twilight Princess, they're not very developed at all. They're very undeveloped, they're very low effort, and not very interesting in a lot of ways. But because they're situated in a low point or a lull in the gameplay, it's fitting that they're low effort and brainless. And maybe someone will disagree if they really enjoy turn-based combat, but I find the extended combat in an RPG such as Paper Mario to be kind of brainless and a slog and represents a low point in the story. Whether that's intentional or not, some would probably disagree with me that it is intentional, and they would say that the combat's the high point of the adventure and the looking around is the boring part. I would say they're probably both the boring part, but don't take my word for anything with regard to this game genre. I've only played half a dozen of them, and maybe eventually you acquire a taste, but as such, that has not happened. as far as I see it thus far, I find the combat to be kind of slow and boring, and maybe that is key to the pacing of the game. That could be a factor. I'm not going to discount that. But in that case, if it's intentionally a low point, the added hassle of button timing and stick flicking just makes a uninteresting part of the game more of a hassle. Frustrating and dull, instead of just being a little dull. So, in theory, the button activations and augmentations in Paper Mario are good, but I think in practice they're unwelcome. I also think, while I'm talking about the game, I think the level design is often quite spotty. Not always, but in many cases the design is just simply trial and error. And in other cases, the game will actively screw you when you're exploring. I ran into a situation where the game had locked a door that was my path forward because I hadn't talked to a NPC yet who would then unlock the door on his way to Shivertown. And I don't know if I've ever loved the idea of progression being locked behind a conversation with an NPC in any game. I didn't really care for it in Link to the Past with Sahasrara, or whatever his name is, where if you don't talk to him, you don't get the Pegasus boots, or in Minish Cap, this was an even worse case where if you didn't step into an innocuous Minish house, the giant library quest wouldn't progress forward at all, which is terrible. So that happened in this game. The trial and error nature of the level design is kind of So you just sort of wander around, failing your way forward. I mean, one could argue that in your first time in a Zelda dungeon, it's trial and error, and I would say they're not correct at all. You can certainly make level design a little more directed, and that's not the case in Paper Mario. At least not for Flower Fields, which is just 7 paths from a tree in 7 different directions, and 7 different fetch quests where you feed a berry to a flower creature of the same color. Very uninteresting. Of course, there are highlights in the levels where they've made an interesting locale of some kind. One of them that really stuck out to me was the sun sitting on a giant medieval-like tower. I like the look of it, and I like the look of it in this particular art style. So it's not like they've done terrible things all around with the levels. It's just that I don't think the level design is very good in this game or in any game that has similar level design. There are high points, granted. I did think that the Palace of Ice, or whatever it's called, is pretty good as far as level design goes, compared to the others anyway. They play with this interesting mirror illusion thing that's memorable and humorous enough. And the level's layout is agreeable, so it's not all bad. And I do enjoy the jungle island where Mount Lava Lava is situated. It's also quite trial and error, but it's, for whatever reason, fun to run around in it because there's not a glut of fetch quests, which this game, as I already mentioned in Flower Fields, can feel like a endless supply of fetch quests where you have to seek out NPCs that are oft interchangeable. I mean, some of them are distinctive, and maybe it's just a result of my very, very long hiatus, but sometimes it was very hard to find who you were looking for. And the houses are interchangeable too sometimes, so yeah, I don't love the level design or the structure of the game or the battle system of it. I think as I've played it for a longer period of time, I think I've learned to tolerate the battle system though, so rather than pretend that the battle system is hypothetically tolerable to people who like this style of game, I can in actuality perhaps say in truth that it is a tolerable thing or becomes semi-tolerable. I don't think it's ever fun, mind you, but as I'm in the Bowser level, there's something to it. Upgrading your guy and gaining levels, but number-based combat is rarely interesting to me, so it's not shocking that I don't love this game's combat, though I do wish the level design was better. Now, I've heard that the story and the writing of Paper Mario are very good, and yeah, the writing's pretty good. I think it's wasted on me because I'm listening to podcasts while I play this because I have no choice. It's the only way for me to feel like I'm redeeming the time when I'm doing these turn-based battles. Again, maybe not even the game's fault. Maybe there's a screw loose in my head, but I don't like turn-based battles. But the writing is reasonably good. I don't know if the story is all that incredible. It's no Huckleberry Finn. I often find the stories of Paper Mario to be pretty simplistic. They do add a extra layer of whatever it is because they're not married to the typical Mario storyline, which is so often insubstantial. Even so, I don't know if these stories merit some of the tedium of the game. But who knows, I haven't seen the ending of it yet, and as I said, the turn-based action is becoming more tolerable as it goes on, but there's a day there where I was tensing my toes in bored anger, or angry boredom, whichever one. So, it's progress. As I am, I'm not sure I would ever write a review for this game because it's hard to suss out how legitimately I feel about it. But, one day we'll get there because there will be a review for this game one day on this show, but that's a while away yet. So until that day comes, that is all I have to say about Paper Mario on this show. Maybe I'll talk about it when I beat it. Briefly. But for this episode anyway, that's all I have to say. And by extension, all I have to say for this segment of what I've been playing, or whatever I'm going to call this segment. And my next segment, the Wii review, will come right after this music break. So stick around if you're inclined. So, welcome back. It is, of course, the Wii game review section of the podcast, and the game I'm going to be talking about this episode is Rabbids Go Home, which is developed by the studio that Michel Ancel of Ubisoft runs. It was released in 2009 as an exclusive for the Wii, though I do believe there's a DS version as well, but I would imagine they're somewhat different. It might be a little hard to put into words what exactly this game is, what genre it falls under. It's for the most part a collectathon-esque platformer, except there's no jumping, and the character that you control is two characters, in fact, in a series of vehicles. Mostly a shopping cart for 75% of the game, but sometimes they deviate from that. And of course, those two characters are Rabbids, the proto-minion, as I understand it, original to the minds of Ubisoft and Michel Ancel. And there's also a third Rabbid with them that is hiding in your Wii remote controller that can be shot out at any time with the aim of the IR reticle. But on screen, you'll only see the two Rabbids in the shopping cart. The premise of the game is a little silly, and yet they do a lot with it. The story, as it is that the Rabbids, a large swarm of them, the two in the shopping cart among them, are trying to get back to their home, the moon, or they think it's their home. And they seek to accomplish that goal by piling junk high enough to reach it. And the two Rabbids that you control set about accomplishing that task. Now, I can be a little soft in the head sometimes, but I eventually figured out that there is a Tower of Babel notion to that story, and the designers of this game smartly laced that theme throughout the entire game in really wonderful ways, which I'll get into briefly. And it serves to elevate this very silly premise far beyond what it would otherwise be. But I'll talk about that later. So, the two Rabbids that you have, I don't think they have any names, can be customized by the player as they see fit. And the customization is really, really good. As someone who's not terribly creative, I was able to come up with interesting skin designs that I was reasonably happy with. One of the Rabbids was Celtic looking with blue paint, and another looked like a bandit, and then the other looked like a radioactive rabbit in a hazmat suit with dark extremities. And as you progress through the game, you'll unlock more customization options, whether that be logos or hats or other things of that ilk. But once the customization is out of the way, or skipped over entirely, the Rabbids set out from their junkyard home to go into the city to start collecting junk. The city is divided into a series of levels, probably about 30 in all, and those levels are situated in malls, office buildings, hospitals, airports, all areas that are commercial in nature. The levels themselves are quite long, definitely longer than your average Mario Galaxy level, and they're relatively open concept, but also linear. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end in kind of a straight shot manner. So it's not Mario 64 or Sunshine, but it's a little more open than, say, Mario 3D World or Mario Galaxy. And the look of each level is very appealing, despite their drab commercial setting. The graphics of the game are low poly in nature, kind of like that of 2016's The Witness. And the colors employed in the game, I don't know if they're exactly pastel. They might not be that faded, but they're very soft. And overall, the game's really good looking. In addition to the pastel look of the game, the soundscape is also really on point. It's a mixture of people talking over the intercom and a lot of classic rock being played on the loudspeakers in the malls and in the hospitals and wherever else the game is situated. Pretty much all of the licensed music in this game is kind of what your parents listen to and what I listen to, really. It's really good stuff, such as John Denver, Bonnie M, in some cases, in a really specific case, Bob Marley, and maybe the Beach Boys. I don't know if I heard them, but music like that, like music you find in the classic rock channel, music for fogies, and combined with the constant intercom messages, the developers succeed in creating a very middle America kind of atmosphere, which in any other game would be kind of boring, but in this game it works. An interesting thing about the atmosphere, though, is that once your characters, the Rabbids, arrive on the scene, the atmosphere that I just described enters a process of fleeing away, and the music is replaced by a loud brass band as the rabbits wreak havoc on the denizens of these commercial biomes. And the friendly messages from the intercom are replaced with a bunch of screaming people that are left in a huff as the Rabbids scream the clothes off them and ransack all their stores and take all their stuff. And the pleasant, boring middle America atmosphere is replaced by chaos. It's an interesting change-up that the game employs through its soundscape and visuals too. Now, since I mentioned the fact that you're stealing stuff from all these locales in the game, the manner that you do that is through your shopping cart, of course, where one Rabbid will sit in the shopping cart and the other will push it. The Rabbid in the shopping cart will scream if the player shakes the Wii remote with their trademark scream. I'm not going to do it. And that will take the clothes off people, so they'll be down to their small clothes, and it will also break barriers and boxes sometimes and will neutralize enemies. And then the other Rabbid pushing the shopping cart with the use of the analog stick will ride over all the things that can be stolen, and they'll be stacked in a comical tower within the shopping cart. And that's what you'll spend the game doing, stealing. And so anything that can be stolen in the game is delineated with a circle, a hand-drawn circle around it. And so there will never be any mystery as to what you can steal. Sometimes you'll have to coax items out of bins or lockers or whatever else with a scream or a boost of the cart. But everything in the game that can be stolen is clear as day. As for the controls of the game, they're reasonably tight, but also just the right amount of squirrely. It reminds me of controlling an actual shopping cart, where it's initially sluggish to get going, but then once you're going, it's squirrely, and the feeling of controlling it is chaotic, like the rest of the game. And so really, most of the game is just controlling the shopping cart with the analog stick. Later on, if you take tight turns, you will build a blue spark drift, kind of like Mario Kart, and once you deploy that with the B trigger on your remote, you can use that mini turbo to crash through people and steal all the items off them without having to pick them up individually, or you can crash into kiosks or whatever those little triangular displays that are freestanding are called, and then get all the items from there without having to gather them up. And you can also use that boost to take bigger jumps off of ramps that are situated throughout the level, or blast through breakable barriers and whatever else the boost can do in the game. There is, of course, also the Rabbid that's living in your remote that you can shoot as a projectile to get rid of certain obstacles, or blast down grates to open up exits. And then there's the Rabbid in the cart that screams too with the shake of the Wii remote. But other than that, I don't think that's all there is to the controls of the game. It's just very simple and a lot of fun anyway, though, thanks to the game feel and the solid level design. It's again very open concept, and the level design isn't bogged down in a over structured kind of manner, but there are a number of obstacles to look out for, such as the spiky cacti, which will take a tick of health from you, or a light bulb as it is conveyed in this game. There's oil that will make you spin out. There's water that will nullify your mini turbo, or the blue spark boost as I called it. There's inflatable barriers. They're either green or red in color. The green one doesn't hurt you at all. It just halts your momentum if you run into it. But the red one will pop and hurt you for some reason if you run into it. And these barriers are both static and moving, depending on the situation. In some cases, the red inflatable barrier will be rolling down a slope or a ramp, kind of like a rolling log obstacle in other platformers, or they'll be attached to a rotating unit that spins at a set rate, and if you poorly time moving between these red inflatable arms, you'll be punished for it. And there's also combat arenas situated in the levels where the humans called Verminators that are dressed in hazmat suits will inflate some obstacles to fence you in, and they'll send in dogs and a variety of their own crew to go after you. And once you've dispatched them with either boosting through them or screaming at them, the barriers will go down and you'll be able to continue progressing. And there's other assets and things still within each level, such as teeter-totter kind of pathways that will dump you if you don't balance the right way. There's quarter pipes situated against walls, and using these quarter pipes you can ride up the wall to get some goodies, or even gain access to a higher landing that you otherwise couldn't reach. And there's other things still, but the levels mainly consist of takeoff ramps and narrow catwalks and obstacles to weave around as you steal junk from these commercial areas and terrorize their residents. And overall, the level design is very good, and the aesthetic is nice, and running around in the cart is a lot of fun, a lot of chaotic fun. The game's not terribly hard because the level design is never that complex until maybe the last 5 levels, and then it really kicks it up a notch. But for the majority of your time, the game's relatively easy. There are consequences for dying, though. If you die, you'll lose your giant stack of goodies that you have in your cart, if you haven't given them to the Rabbid with the tuba. And the main conceit of the game is that you have to pile a flat sum of junk in order to access new levels and beat the game overall. I think the number is 23,000 feet. The pile has to be 23,000 feet tall before the game is over. So if you do die, it can set you back a ways. And there's only a finite amount of stuff in each level, so you can't farm certain sections to make up for what you've lost. You just have to start the level over again if you were dead set on regaining what you'd lost. So it's not entirely toothless, but otherwise the game is a pleasant little jaunt in terms of difficulty and complexity for the most part. There are deviations from your typical shopping cart vehicle, though. There's a runaway jet turbine from an airplane that you ride on through 2 separate levels, and so the speed of those levels is much greater than your typical level. And then there's a handful of levels where the Rabbids ride in an inner tube, either sliding downhill or using the inner tube to bounce uphill, all the while avoiding thistle bushes and bottomless pits as they do so. And then there's other levels where you're in the shopping cart, but you have to chase another vehicle before it gets too far away from you, and other things of that sort. And those deviations are really good in that they shake up the formula without straying too far from it. It's still a similar mode of movement to that of the shopping cart. So all in all, on a mechanical level, the game is a unique platformer that is sound in its level design, never really going too crazy with it though, and is pleasant to look at and listen to as well. So in terms of just surface level things, Rabbids Go Home is successful. The thing though that makes this game really interesting though is its use of themes and atmosphere, and I don't really want to say story because it's not really story so much. There's not really story beats in it, but the game is really good at telling a story passively through its visuals and sound and the progression of its sound and visuals, more importantly. For one thing, the game, I already mentioned it earlier, but as the mayhem ensues, the minute you take out the loudspeakers in those levels, the dad rock or folksy rock music of the 70s is replaced by a brass band, which it turns out that brass band is Romanian in nature. The music is some kind of Romanian genre. I wonder if my uncle knows any of it, but the sound is changed out for this very loud, chaotic Romanian music, which sometimes is almost hard to discern if it has any kind of melody. It's so rapid and fast and chaotic like the Rabbids, and that's why it's their music. But then other times it's also really good. Some of the tracks are really solid, really beautiful even. And it's a nice little way of shifting the atmosphere in a hands-off manner. And the music isn't just music in this game. It kind of represents something, at least as I see it. The soft rock playing on the loudspeakers represents commercialism, consumerism and corporatism, and not the ugliest form of these isms, but just sort of a placid version of them, a stifling version of them. The people aren't suffering, they're comfortable, but they're weighed down with busy lives and overbearing jobs, as seen by the secretary riding the moped that you have to follow in certain levels because her boss is shouting at her over the intercom. And these isms are also just displayed by the levels themselves. Airports, office buildings, hospitals, and malls, all these busy centers of society. And the people therein, they're also kind of comically low detail. They kind of have square limbs and they're very interchangeable, very cookie cutter. I think I read in a review where they complained about the poor human character models, and they are poor, but I think it's very intentional. They're lifeless and low energy and unenthusiastic compared to the Rabbids due to the stifling culture they live in. And the Rabbids, on the other hand, are chaotic and energetic and just inherently having a good time all the time. They're unbecoming in their characteristics overall, but they're quite the opposite of these humans. And so as these agents of chaos overturn the lives of these people, even the music will demonstrate that. Once the loudspeakers are knocked down by the Rabbids, that Romanian music will just kick in, and it's, at least as I see it, representing this overturning of commercialism and corporatism and materialism, more importantly. It's a kind of a revolution by happenstance. In a way, you're liberating these people from their mundane existence, even as you're terrorizing them and unraveling their society and civilization. And that dovetails very nicely with the Tower of Babel motif that the game is alluding to in its premise, in which God comes down from heaven to disperse this great city that's been built on account of the tower that they're building to the heavens. In the same way, this civilization is being unraveled because of the tower of junk that the Rabbids are building to the moon to reach it. And a smart thing they do in this game to evoke the theme of the Tower of Babel is that whenever you're in an elevator, the elevator music is By the Rivers of Babylon by Bonnie M. in a vehicle that ascends and descends. That's a really nice pairing. I really enjoy that. So the Tower of Babel angle is definitely there in this game. Even the babbling of the Rabbids is kind of an echo, if you think about it. That might be happenstance, but maybe not. I mean, it's baked into the game is all I'm saying, and the game's better for it. It's really good theming. This idea of congested society being dispersed. And these aren't necessarily deep themes, but juxtaposed with these obnoxious and somewhat annoying, unlikable creatures, they do give this game some sense of grandeur and sophistication in its atmosphere, even if it otherwise wouldn't have it. It's an interesting pairing, at the very least, and a surprising one. And it's handled in a very excellent hands-off way. It's not told through self-important exposition or overbearing cutscenes. It's just dispersed passively throughout the entire game. And someone else might have a different read on the themes of this game, but the Tower of Babel motif is certainly in there. Another thing I like about the story in this game is, well, it's a little thing, but I like the visual representation of the terror that the Rabbids are visiting upon this city. At the start of the game, the people don't necessarily know what to make of you, but as the game progresses, they start wearing helmets, and I think there's an increase in dogs with them to protect them, and then by the end of the game, they're all wearing hazmat suits, and the levels are congested with all manner of defenses and whatnot. And I think in perhaps the last mission of the game, or the second last, the airports are right full of people trying to get out. It really just shows how afraid people have become without saying a word. I like it a lot. It's good storytelling. And that kind of storytelling really elevates the game as a whole. The mechanics of the game are solid and they're very unique, and they have enough change-ups within, and the main conceit of the game is also really fun, but the atmosphere and music and passive storytelling make for a game that's more than the sum of its parts. I don't think there's anything else to say about the game, except for the fact that it ends with a real bang. The last 5 levels of the game are much more complex and interesting than the rest of the levels, and they kick the difficulty and the creativity up a notch, and they serve as a really good crescendo for the overall adventure. The Vegas level is particularly good in that last batch. It has a lot of moving platforms and components that you have to navigate, and it's just a beautiful level with all the flashing signs and things of that manner. It's not in Vegas, but it reminds me of Vegas anyhow. And the airport level, or the one before it, is really excellent because in a game where you can't jump, it introduces these bouncy luggage pads that are on a moving conveyor belt, and it's a real challenge trying to bound over to the end. And it's just all really good, those last 5 levels. But the final level, I think it's called Top of the Pile, is just astounding. I don't know if it's astounding, but it's really good. It takes place in the junkyard where everything started, and you're climbing the pile that you've made over the course of the game. And the level design is fairly intense. There's a lot of teetery bridges and seesaw walkways. Some of them are contorted in a number of shapes. And I think you're carrying a cow on your cart the entire time, so you're extra unwieldy. And the humans are doing everything they can to stop you with a intense barrage of obstacles and traps. But the best thing about that level is not the level design. It's this really excellent song that's playing. I imagine it's Romanian. It's brassy like the rest of the songs, but the song is just, it's beautiful. It's like it's a beautiful serenade. It really lends a poignancy to a game that otherwise doesn't deserve it, really. I mean, or you would think it doesn't deserve it. It's a Rabbids game, but it's such an excellent send-off. I don't know if I can get the music on here, but I'll probably not. No, I'm not going to get your hopes up. But it's a really great song. It's really retrospective in its tone somehow. And the brass in the song is just beautiful, and it's, as I said, incredibly poignant and effective, and really is, I don't know if it's one of the best endings to a game ever, but it's very successful. The level design is good and harrowing, unlike the rest of the game where it's never that harrowing at all. But in this level, the level design is harrowing, and the music is also matching that intensity in a different way, in a emotional manner. It's really well put together. So the game caps off really nicely. I think with that's all I have to say about Rabbids Go Home. But to quickly summarize before I move into the number score portion of the review, Rabbids Go Home is a unique and beautiful platformer with solid level design, and whose central conceit is not only interesting in matters of gameplay, but also serves as a springboard for interesting storytelling, which in turn gives the game an air of sophistication. Now, as for the number score that I'm going to give Rabbids Go Home, the game certainly has a large stack of pros in its favor. Solid level design, unique character movement in the form of the shopping cart and the other vehicles that are well implemented alongside the shopping cart. The game looks really good throughout, even though the locales would otherwise be sterile. The pastel look of the game really shines throughout. The music is excellent. The clash of middle-class American rock music and Romanian big brass band kind of music is really interesting and dynamic. The tail end of the game is really excellent and ups the ante. The storytelling is really sophisticated for a game that you wouldn't think deserves that kind of sophistication. And there's all the positives I mentioned throughout the review, whatever other ones there are. There are some cons, though. The level design is solid throughout the game, but it's never truly excellent. It's kind of lax in its complexity, and as a result, the game can feel a little lethargic. It's chaotic enough and just innately pleasing enough that it's never a huge issue, but they don't really flex their design muscles till the end of the game. But it's not really a huge deal. What they did create works, and it flows really well with the other components of the game. The reuse of assets in some levels is a bit more of a glaring flaw. For instance, the two levels where you are piloting the escaped jet turbine are almost identical. the second one is just more difficult. And some of the levels where you chase the cow in the back of the pickup truck, they don't necessarily distinguish themselves as being any different from each other, particularly the last two. And I'm sure there's other examples of reusing ideas, such as the secretary on the moped. There's maybe 3 levels where you end up chasing her around. So the game definitely isn't chock full of ideas, mechanically speaking. But even that's not a huge deal. The turbine level being the most egregious asset reuse is inoffensive because both levels are enjoyable, and that goes with all the rest of the examples of reusing ideas. It works, and they usually iterate on those ideas, and those recurring characters within certain levels are thematically important anyway. So really it's just a small handful of levels that are lazy in their reuse, but it's not detrimental by any means. I'm not sure there's really any other cons than those two. The game length isn't any kind of issue. It's maybe 9-10 hours long, maybe shorter if you gun it, but the length is perfect for the kind of game that it is. And the pace of the game is excellent. There's really no real issues with the game other than the somewhat simple level design and the reuse of some ideas and assets. So I'm a little hesitant to give the game a 8. I'd much rather give it a 7.5 and a smiley face, but the game's an 8. It's just inches over into greatness, in my opinion, with its fine veneer of storytelling and atmosphere. It's a really well put together game in a lot of ways. When I played it on the Wii in January, it was one of those surprising games that really show how many hidden gems are on the Wii. It's just a great game. And so it gets an 8 out of 10. Despite my reticence. As for where I'm going to rank it, I wouldn't put it above Mario Strikers Charged, because I just don't think it's as rich in gameplay as Mario Strikers Charged, and aesthetically Mario Strikers Charged is also very strong, even though I would say this game is stronger. But on gameplay, I'd put it below Mario Strikers Charged. And same goes with Punch-Out. I just think Punch-Out is a much more interesting and engaging experience, whereas this game is more passive and pleasant, while also being slightly chaotic, but it's still easygoing, and it never challenges you the way Punch-Out does. And then, of course, there's Sin and Punishment, which is a really excellent arcade shooter. So again, it's a question of gameplay, and I would say that Sin and Punishment 2 is a richer gameplay experience than Rabbids Go Home. But I think I'm going to go against what I was initially going to do when I started this episode and put Rabbids Go Home above Sin and Punishment 2, because the vision and scope of Rabbids Go Home is just excellent, and how it's put together makes up for any disparity in gameplay between it and Sin and Punishment 2, because again, the gameplay in Rabbids Go Home is really good. And thinking about how inscrutable and somewhat dumb the story of Sin and Punishment 2 is, as unimportant as it is and harmless as it is, it's still there, so it can be judged ever so slightly because of it. And judging it against the storytelling of Rabbids Go Home, it's not a favorable comparison. So I think on the strength of its atmosphere and storytelling and unique gameplay and structural conceits, I'm going to put Rabbids Go Home above Sin and Punishment 2 star successor. And with that, I'm going to call it a day. So for a quick rundown on the rankings, you have Mario Strikers Charged at number 1, Punch-Out at number 2, Rabbids Go Home at number 3, Sin and Punishment 2 at number 4, No More Heroes at number 5, No More Heroes 2 Desperate Struggle at number 6, Wario Land Shake It at number 7, Metroid Other M at number 8, GoldenEye at number 9, Excite Truck at number 10, and taking up the rear guard once more, Battalion Wars 2 at number 11. And with that, that will conclude this episode, since there is no listener mail to respond to. If you would like to remedy that, you can send a question or comment or refutation at the address nalistenerq@gmail.com. That is nalistenerq@gmail.com. And until the next show, I hope that you, the listeners, have a blessed day, and may good fortune find you.